In the final, chaotic days of the Second World War, as Nazi Germany crumbled, the world began to confront the scale of its crimes. Among the most haunting discoveries was Bergen Belsen, a concentration camp steeped in death, disease, and despair. When British troops liberated it in April 1945, they stumbled into a living nightmare. Tens of thousands of corpses, skeletal survivors, and the unflinching stares of the camp's guards. But what shocked many even more was who some of those guards were. Young women, some barely out of their teens, had played key roles in managing the camp's cruelty. They gave orders, carried out beatings, and watched over mass suffering with cold detachment. In the months that followed, these women stood trial. Their names, faces, and crimes became part of a justice process that would culminate not in forgiveness, but in execution, swift and public. Their reckoning had come. Bergen Belsen began as a prisoner of war camp in 1940. By 1943, it had transformed into a concentration camp under SS control. Located in northern Germany, it became a dumping ground for inmates from across the Nazi camp system. Jews, political prisoners, Roma, and others marked for death by exhaustion, neglect, or disease. Unlike Auschwitz or Treblinka, Bergen Belsen had no gas chambers. Death came slowly and painfully through starvation, untreated illness, and overcrowding. By the war's end, conditions had deteriorated beyond comprehension. Food supplies vanished, sanitation collapsed, and mass death became routine. When British forces arrived on April 15, 1945, they found over 60,000 prisoners in appalling condition, and at least 13,000 unburied corpses strewn across the grounds. The liberators were stunned. Soldiers and journalists described the stench, the silence, the skeletal figures wandering among the dead. Medical teams worked around the clock, but thousands more would die in the following weeks. Photographs and newsreels captured the horror, searing Bergen Belsen into the public consciousness. It wasn't long before responsibility became a central question. Among those arrested were not only SS men, but several female guards who had been integral to the camp's daily operations. Their fate would soon be decided. In the machinery of the Nazi concentration camp system, women played a more active role than many imagined. At Bergen Belsen, female SS guards, known as Aufseherinnen, were not mere assistants. They were enforcers, disciplinarians, and, in many cases, perpetrators of calculated cruelty. Most of these women were recruited from working-class backgrounds, often through job advertisements promising stable government employment. Training took place at Ravensbrück, the largest camp for women in the Reich, where recruits were taught to obey without question and to harden themselves emotionally. Upon arrival at camps like Bergen Belsen, they were given authority over female prisoners, many of whom were Jewish, political dissidents, or Roma, tasked with maintaining order through intimidation and violence. Unlike the male SS, whose atrocities were widely documented, the brutality of the female guards was sometimes overlooked. But survivor testimonies tell a different story. These women were known for beatings with whips and rifle butts, starvation punishments, and sadistic games that turned prisoners into targets of public humiliation or pain. They were not anomalies. Their presence in the camps was part of a broader strategy to normalize terror and expand control. Bergen Belsen's female guards, many in their 20s, embodied this horror with disturbing ease. Their smiles and photos taken during the war's final months betray no remorse, only a chilling confidence that their roles were justified, their power absolute. But liberation changed everything. Their authority collapsed, and their crimes were exposed to a world that demanded justice. Among the many female guards arrested at Bergen Belsen, a few became infamous for the scale of their cruelty and the clarity of the evidence against them. Their names would be etched into history as examples of how ordinary women could become instruments of extraordinary violence. Irma Grese, often called The hyena of Auschwitz was just 22 years old when she was captured. She had served at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz before being transferred to Bergen Belsen. Tendencies: she wielded power with a chilling detachment. Prisoners testified that she beat them with rubber truncheons, set dogs on them for minor offenses, and selected inmates for death with a smile. Her beauty made her more notorious, but it was her cruelty that sealed her fate. She was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. Elisabeth Falkenrath was another senior SS overseer who had served at both Auschwitz and Bergen Belsen. She oversaw the women's barracks and held significant authority in prisoner selection for forced labor or extermination. Witnesses described her as brutal, indifferent to suffering, and complicit in beatings and selections that led to countless deaths. Her rank and responsibilities left no doubt of her role in the camp's horrors. Like Grace, she was sentenced to death. Herta Bodhi, often remembered as the smiling guard from liberation photos, was 24 at the time of her arrest. Taller and more physically imposing than many of her peers, she was accused of beating inmates severely, sometimes to death. Though she denied these charges, multiple survivors named her during the trial. Unlike Gracie and Volkenrath, both received a 10-year sentence. She was released early and lived until 2000, largely in obscurity. These women were not exceptions, but symbols of a system that blurred gender and morality. Their crimes, and the sentences that followed, challenged the world to reckon with the face of female evil in a male-dominated regime. In September 1945, just months after the liberation of Bergen Belsen, the British military convened a war crimes tribunal in the German city of Lüneburg. Known as the Belsen trial, it was one of the first major efforts to hold Nazi perpetrators legally accountable. 20 women were among the 45 defendants, many of them former SS guards at Bergen Belsen and Auschwitz. The proceedings marked a turning point. For the first time, female participation in organized mass violence was scrutinized under the harsh light of justice. Survivors testified in harrowing detail, naming guards and recounting beatings, starvation, and killings. The court heard how some women showed initiative in cruelty, selecting prisoners for punishment, using dogs to terrorize inmates, or striking them until they collapsed. Irma Gracie, Elisabeth Falkenrath, and other prominent figures quickly became central to the trial. Despite their youth and gender, the evidence against them was overwhelming. The tribunal did not excuse their actions. In December 1945, 11 of the convicted, including Grace and Volkenrath, were sentenced to death. They were hanged shortly thereafter by British executioner Albert Pierre Point. Herta Bothe and others received prison terms. The sentencing reflected both the severity of their crimes and the evolving understanding that evil was not bound by gender. The trial also set an early precedent for prosecuting crimes against humanity, laying groundwork for the Nuremberg trials and international law. For many observers, the Belsen trial was not only about justice, it was about exposure. The world saw images of these women, heard their denials and defenses, and witnessed the moment when ideology, obedience, and cruelty met their final judgment. The message was clear: participation in genocide, no matter your role or gender, would not be forgotten or forgiven. The executions of Irma Grace, Elisabeth Falkenrath, and others took place on December 13, 1945. It was a swift and clinical end, conducted at Hamelin Prison in the early morning hours by Britain's chief executioner. Grace was the youngest woman executed under British law in the 20th century, just 22 years old. Her final moments, reported with morbid fascination in newspapers, added to her notoriety. Others, like Herta Bothe, served prison sentences and were eventually released. Some faded into obscurity, changing their names or retreating into silence. A few, when interviewed in later years, expressed defiance or claimed innocence, denying responsibility for the suffering they had overseen. Their lives after the trial became part of a larger struggle over how to remember and interpret female perpetrators of the Holocaust. The legacy of Bergen Belsen and its guards is still debated. For decades, The narrative of Nazi atrocities centered on male commanders and soldiers, while the role of women was minimized or forgotten. But the stories of these SS guards shattered that illusion, proving that women could be not only complicit in genocidal systems, but actively violent within them. Today, memorials at Bergen Belsen commemorate the victims, not the perpetrators. Yet the memory of those trials, and of the young women who stood accused, continues to challenge us. It forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths, that cruelty wears many faces, and that evil can be ordinary, even familiar. The execution of the female guards was not the end. It was the beginning of remembering. The story of Bergen Belsen's female SS guards is a grim reminder that brutality is not confined by gender. These women, many young and seemingly unremarkable, became agents of a regime built on dehumanization and death. Their trials and executions served justice, but also raised unsettling questions about the nature of obedience, power, and personal choice in systems of evil. As history continues to unearth their roles and reckon with their legacies, one truth remains: remembering is not optional, it is essential. And so, we are left to ask ourselves, what would justice look like if the same horrors happened today?